Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Okay, everyone, welcome. Thanks for coming. Today, you wouldn't be here unless you didn't read our newsletter. You know what the book's about. Gerald FitzGerald he worked for the Port Authority for 30 years. He managed all the major airports in New York, and he's from Albany, although he doesn't live here anymore, so it's sort of a welcome home. And he's combined his love of politics, history, religion, and the power, how these places use power, with his father's life, which he'll tell us about, all combined in this sort of very intriguing, fast-paced book. I just finished it this morning. It's very good. And it's got a little of everything. It's got the Knights Templar and the Cathedral at Chartres and Druids and the Vatican and all kinds of intrigue. So here's Gerald FitzGerald to tell us all about it.
Thank you very much. I'm very, very pleased to be here this afternoon. Some personal background. My family, both my mother and my father, were born and raised in Albany. My father was born in a house on Summit Avenue. I'm not exactly sure anymore how you get there, but I remember being in the house on Summit Avenue. My mother's family was on Western Avenue, with some of the relatives living on the corner of Western and Manning Boulevard. So I had a brother and two sisters. We were all born in Brady Maternity Hospital here in Albany. We used to come up to Albany every summer. So July and August, my mother would take the children from New York City and come up to spend it with her mother. So we're at my grandmother's house for many, many years. And then other aunts and uncles were in Albany. So Albany was always a home base. And anytime my parents were in New York City and they talked about going up home, it was to be in Albany. And both of them are buried in St. Agnes Cemetery. So there's a special place in my heart for Albany. My own experience, I worked for 30 years for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, all on the airport management side of things. So I worked at Kennedy, LaGuardia, and Newark airports, which are the three airports owned and operated by the Port Authority. I finished there as the director of aviation, so I was responsible for those three airports. And then I went to an engineering firm called Parsons Brinkerhoff, which constructs airports. And I stayed there for 8 years. And now I'm in my own consulting company on airport security. Because of all the traveling around that I did, I was not one that was able to sleep on airplanes very much. And I had my laptop with me. And as they say, each of us has at least one book. And this has been mine. And I started to do it while traveling on airplanes on my laptop. And I would say about 75% of the book was written on an airplane over a good number of years, 3 to 4 years. So that's how I got into that, being on an airplane for 8 hours, not being able to sleep, reading somewhat, and decided this was the time by myself without interruption, and I could start my book. Let's talk about seat of power, and why did I select this as a topic? I've been a great reader of history all my life, and I'm a firm believer that if you look closely, history repeats itself, and yet people don't seem to learn from history. So we're all people. People 10,000 years ago, believe it or not, had a lot of our own frailties and a lot of our own mistakes that they made, things that they thought about. I don't think people have changed that much. So if you go back thousands of years to one of my favorite points in time, Stonehenge in England, that circular monument in stone that people to this day haven't figured out. If you go from there to the present, people had two basic issues, was politics and religion. And Stonehenge is a monument to religion. Whatever religion they had at the time, they thought about, what is life? Why am I here? What about the stars? What about my creator? And that was the religion thought. The politics side was, well, if you join our tribe, we'll take better care of you than the other tribe. And you move forward by a few thousand years, and the same issues are there. It's politics and religion. Whether you're in the Crusades and you want to go back and rescue the Holy Land because they are religious shrines, or whether it's political motivation because the people in Europe wanted the land where the shrines were based and the money that was there was politics and religion. And today, whether you go to Baghdad or Belfast, it's still about politics and religion. It hasn't changed much. So we really haven't learned very much over all this time. So when I began to write this story, I wanted to make a statement about politics and religion. So around this fiction is 75% historical fact. Fact that maybe when you read about the fiction portion of it, that might gain your interest. While you're reading that, you're going to read the facts in history about how religion has been used by people in power to gain what they want. I think they learn very early. It's more effective to threaten someone's soul than it is to threaten their life. Because if you just kill them, you kill them. But if you tell them, if you don't do what I say, you're going to be condemned forever, all eternity. The uneducated people pay attention to that. So religion has been used as an excuse, as often as it's been used by well-intended people to explain to us what life is all about. So I had this feeling about history and about religion and politics. And that was something, after spending a good portion of my life reading history, that I wanted to make a statement about. So you put that aside for a second. Then you come to Albany and my father. And as I look back on his life, this book, in a lot of ways, is about him. Because I took his character. He was born in Albany, went to Christian Brothers Academy, what's called CBA in those days, and he was selected. He chose to join the seminary for the Albany Diocese to become a Catholic priest. And he went off to the seminary at 17, and a few years later, he was the one person selected from the Albany Diocese to continue his studies for the priesthood in Rome. And each diocese in the U.S. every year has the option. They don't send someone every year, but they have the option to send someone to Rome to finish their studies. So around 1920, here's this young man from Albany, New York, getting on a boat to go to Rome to finish studying for the priesthood. And he arrives there only to learn all the classes are in Italian. So his first task was to learn Italian, which he kept until the day he died. So he's there in Rome. He studied there for 5 years. And a year before ordination, he changed his mind and came back to Albany, to the big disappointment of his family, because they all talk to him about my son, the priest. And if he's in Rome, he's probably going to be Pope. You know? So there were always comments of great disappointment in the family about his failure to do that. So he comes back to Albany. Although by this time he had finished more than 5 years beyond high school, he only had a high school diploma. So he had to compete as a high school graduate. He went to work for the Times-Union and spent 3 or 4 years there. And I've researched his life, and there are many other things he tried to do. At that point, he married my mother. Her name was Marie McShane. And they moved to New York City. And that's where I was raised. We came back to Albany to be born, but we were raised in New York City. So I often wondered, what would have happened to him if in his Times-Union experience, he became a successful reporter and progressed to the Washington Post or something, and then there was some great challenge going on in the Vatican. And because as a student he studied there and he knew the people, maybe he'd go over there and somehow be able to understand it more than anyone else. That's the basis of my fiction. The fiction is the Pope and the President get into a big battle in a re-election year. And the President says, I don't care about this terrorist the Vatican's giving sanctuary to. You know, think about it. Osama bin Laden winds up in the Vatican. And the President says, oh, we don't care about him. The war on terror is bigger than one man. Of course, as soon as he finishes that statement, he goes to the CIA and says, go get him. Okay? So what do politicians do? They say one thing and they do another. Then you go to the Pope. And the Pope says, well, we're giving him sanctuary because we want to try and be a player in the Mideast peace process. But actually, the terrorist has said, if you don't give me sanctuary, I'm going to release secrets about the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. So guess what? The Pope says one thing, and he does something else too. The consistencies between the Pope and the President? Yes. If you're a leader, whether it's the church or the government or Enron or a university, at some point, you kind of do what you want, unless there's some system of accountability. And if you look at our institutions, unfortunately, they're managed by human beings, and we all have our frailties, and at some point we all have our weaknesses. And if you go back in history, again and again and again in history, it pops up. And people say, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And these observers of history, and you go back, whether it's the Roman historians, or it's the people in the Middle Ages, or it's Mark Twain, they're all making the same observation. So in putting this story together, I take my father's life to give me a little inside information on what the Vatican's doing with this terrorist. But it gives me an opportunity to explain, how does the Vatican work? Who are their secretaries of the various departments? And how do they get there? And what do they do? And how does the U.S. government work? And you put those together, that's factual. Then you bring in trying to get the terrorist down as the thriller portion of the story. I had great fun doing it. I used some of my examples from the Port Authority in working there, giving this reporter some success that brought him to Washington. Now, why is he in Washington? You read the book. Well, there was a big issue about the Concorde coming into Kennedy Airport, and this reporter exposed all of that. That there were some bribes that were given out to people in the New York State legislature that created an investigation on behalf of the British and the French. It's in the book. And go look it up. Factual. Came out 5 years after the fact, and a lot of people were embarrassed. Although to be in Albany and you're a politician, you have to be embarrassed. That's all part of the game. That's in the book. So I've used some of those experiences. And then I've gone back to the church history part of things. Again, factual. On the cover of the book, there is the lower right-hand corner is a stained glass window. Now that stained glass window is from a cathedral outside Paris, Chartres Cathedral. Now that cathedral was built by the Masons, who were an offspring of the Knights Templar, which are the people who fought in the Crusades. They built that church on top of Druid ruins that had been there for 1,000 years. And the Druid ruins, when they first were constructed on that site, dedicated their site to the Black Madonna. Interesting piece of history. When you think 1,000 years before Christianity, there was a site dedicated to the Madonna. Interesting. That stained glass on the cover is the only stained glass series in the world in a Christian church that contains the signs of the zodiac. Not pictures from the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament, the signs of the zodiac. Now, what were the Knights Templar, the Masons, trying to say by putting the signs of the zodiac into a church built on top of Druid ruins? Question mark. Then I linked that to the fact that when the Romans demolished the Temple of Solomon in 72 AD, and they went in and destroyed Jerusalem, they had a historian, part of that army. His name was Josephus. And you go and you read his account of the sacking of Jerusalem. And when they went into the Temple of Solomon, into the Holy of Holies, it was surrounded by a veil. On the veil were the 7 signs of the zodiac. Interesting connection between Jewish tradition, Druid tradition, the Knights Templar, Christianity. And you say, well, signs of the zodiac, that's really astrology. And as Christians, we don't believe that. Except at Bethlehem. when the wise men followed the stars. Interesting connection. So I think in the book, what I've tried to do is to bring out historic facts in a way you can do with fiction, but you can't necessarily do in other type writings. So that's surrounding, so in this book, yes, it's a fictional account. The fight between the Pope and the President is fiction. The Vatican did not give sanctuary to a terrorist. But the rest of it is a lot of fact there that I think people should know. And one of the statements I make in the book is that I think in terms of religion, my own personal feeling is that our Creator gave everybody, every group, every civilized group, a little hint about his existence, whether you're in the South Sea Islands or in Africa or in any other religious context. Everybody has a little piece of the puzzle. Until we all sit down and talk to each other and connect the dots, we're never going to figure it out. As soon as one group thinks they have all the answers and they don't talk to anybody else, you know they're wrong. So I put that through here to try and bring together a history of religion, historically, factually, at the same time telling a story about people abusing power. And if you think about religion, well-intended people, and very often some person grabs a hold of that religion and then distorts the message and uses that institution for their own purposes. And we've seen that in our lives many times, whether it's a Christian or Jewish or Islamic or what have you. And with Islam being so current today, I also point out in the book, the very first jihad that was ever carried out was by the Crusaders. Because they were told anybody who went on the Crusades and died killing Muslims would get a plenary indulgence for all their sins and go right to heaven. Now, it's much different than the jihad today in terms of we should go kill other people. But understand the similarities between the distortion of religious intention. So religion and politics, they always tell you don't discuss religion and politics. But that's what's in this book. It's trying to bring together politics and religion and point out to people that the seat of power, someone who sits there, can distort the truth. And very often, my own experience is the person sitting in the seat of power is not the one in charge at all. It's somebody behind the scenes who's manipulating them, telling them what to say, writing the words on their teleprompter, perhaps. And they're the ones who are in power. So the seat of power, it might appear that the person there is the one who's in charge. But very often, it's somebody standing back in the shadows. So now, how did this all take place? How did I write this once I had it finished? I sent out the first draft to about 8 people. 4 people I knew, friends and family, and 4 were strangers. And they read the first draft, sent it back to me, and I examined what I had. If more than one person made the same comment, I paid attention to it. In some ways, changed what I had written. So I listened to what the readers were telling me. And I did that for about 1.5 years, sent it out again to another group, and did the same thing. And then I had my final version. And I say it was final because I had spent so much time on it. Every time I picked it up, I was rewriting it and recognized that you had to stop because you could rewrite it forever. I decided that's it. I read it now, and there's lots of things I'd like to change. But I decided no more changes, let's go into production. And then it took me well over 1.5 years to go through agents, publishers, some luck, some not so good, people telling me no, 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 no. And by the way, really no. And fortunately, I had some people who were known in the industry who I was able to go to and say, I haven't been able to figure this out yet. And they said, let me help you. Do this, do that, and then I started to get things to happen. So for people who are doing it on their own, not knowing the right path to take, you waste a tremendous amount of time, tremendous amount. So I was fortunate to have someone who gave me some insight on which paths to go down, and it made the job a little bit easier. When I signed the contract for the book, I signed it in April. The book was not published until following February. The publisher had 350 titles in production. And every time I called up, it would be a week before anyone called me back. And to make changes were very difficult. I went through three drafts, publisher drafts, where they took it and wanted to make changes, and I had to talk to them and back and forth and back and forth. Very long process. When I see somebody who writes a book on something that happened 6 weeks ago and the book's published, I'm just amazed. I just don't know. Obviously, the publisher pays a lot of attention to them. The process of publishing a book is very, very tedious. Very, 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 very tedious. But it was out and it was published. The book right now is on Amazon.com, and that's where most of the action has been. We've sold between 700 and 800 copies, and it's been slowly picking up some steam. I've been doing these kind of tours around in different cities and talking to people, and every few people who get it, there's a few who like it, a few who don't. They pick it up, they tell their friends. Very slow process, but it has been building. And it's been a tremendous amount of fun for me. I would never do it again. I don't think. It was very hard. Now, the research. People say, well, how did you do all this research? Because, as I said, a lot of fact in here about thousands of years of history, church history. How did you do all that? Over 25 years of reading. So I drew on knowledge. On the Knights Templar, I probably read at least 10 books just on the Knights Templar. And when you go to read the facts, and you're saying, this Charters Cathedral, now there was a Charters Mystery School. It was called the Mystery School in Charters before the cathedral was built. Why Mystery School in Charters? Because there was something about the area. The same reason that the Druids built their first temple there, the Mystery School was formed. Well, what happened to the Mystery School? Well, at one point in time, an abbey took over, and he became a saint of the Catholic Church. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the father of all clairvoyance, was the abbey at the Mystery School. Interesting connection. Now, how did he get to be abbot? It turns out, at one point in time, the European families who had been collecting religious secrets on their own from the pyramids, from all around the world, had a collection of religious secrets. Why? Because in those days, religious secrets were considered power. Somehow the people would respond if you had some kind of religious secret. So there were 30 young men taken from a variety of these families who all became priests in this abbey at the same time, all 30 of them, from different families. And one of these priests, one of these young men, was Bernard, and he became the leading abbot of the Mystery School. He was also one of the ones who sponsored and pushed the people to join the Crusades, to go recapture the Holy Land. But the people in power were more interested in the land and the treasure than they were in saving the Holy Land. Politics and religion. The brothers of those 30 became the Knights Templar and went to the Holy Land during the Crusades. This group of Knights Templars, why Knights Templars? Because they were knights who had control of the Temple of Solomon. Knights Templar. They took control of the temple and they dug underneath it looking for religious secrets. What did they find? We're not sure. But during that time, there is proof, written evidence, that the Mystery School hired translators who could speak Arabic. So are they sending back details from Jerusalem that need translation? It would appear. Now, what happened to the Knights Templar? What did they find? Well, they found treasure and religious secrets. And they came back, and all the families, the king and the pope, said, okay, what did you find? And we said, we're not telling you. What? Well, we sent you over to find this. But they were smart. They knew what they had. They had both treasure, and they had the religious secrets. Holy Grail. In fact, if you read back into history, the first big relic was the image of Christ on a cloth from the time of the crucifixion. Now, is that the Shroud of Turin? I don't know. But that was the first relic. The Grail came later, about the cup used at the Last Supper. And then the treasure. The Knights Templar did not give those back to the Pope and the King. Interesting combination, the Pope and the King. Religion and politics. Knights Templar didn't give them the treasures. What did they do? On October the 13th, Friday the 13th, you wonder why Friday the 13th is bad? On Friday the 13th in October, Friday the 13th, about 500 years ago, the king went out to all of the places the Knights Templar were and took them all into custody and killed most of them because they wanted the treasure and the relics. Never found the treasure. Where is the treasure? No one knows. How many people look for the treasure? One of the most successful persons who had the largest expedition searching for the treasure of the Knights Templar was FDR. The 29-year-old man, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, organized an expedition into Nova Scotia because there had been found some underground caves that had been built about the time the Templars went underground. And there was a series of underground caves. He was convinced the treasure was there. So he organized an expedition looking for that. At that time, he was not part of the Knights Templar, but he was part of the Masons. And so was George Bush, and so was Winston Churchill, and so was George Washington, and Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson. This is what's in our background. This is history. This is facts. It's a fact that FDR did that. The fact that the Knights Templar were killed by the Pope and the King. It's a fact that the mystery school was formed in charters. And as we look to all of this, what's going on? But what's going on, in my mind, is history and religion over time is distorted by leadership. And we have to look at that and say, they're only human. We shouldn't be surprised, whether it's the Pope or it's the head of Enron. People in charge of big things often do bad things. And we have to kind of keep that in mind as we listen to them. So these are the facts that are in the book. I tried to bring it all together. And then, of course, you have to make a story. One of the stories in here, which comes from my father's time in Rome, by the way, and I'll give you another little piece. I went back to Rome in 1998, and I was there on business, knocked on the door of the North American College, and said, I'd like to examine my father's records. So this Monsignor says to me, well, okay, but are you prepared for what you find? I said, well, he says, well, I don't know why he left. He said, I'll show you the records, but what's ever there, you have to be prepared for. I thought for a minute. I said, well, I think I know my father, but if I'm surprised, I'm surprised. So he gets a big book, looks down, finds his name, right-hand column, left of his own volition. He says, that's good. We didn't kick him out. Okay, good. So then this Monsignor, takes me into the cafeteria where all the seminarians from the North America are studying for the priesthood. There must have been about 100 of them. And he calls them to their tent. He said, we have a visitor here today. And he says, it's not often the children of our students come to visit us. And I would say, yeah, I guess it's not often that the children of your seminarians come back to see you. He said, so this is a very unusual person, and they told me, so thank him very much. I then go back to the U.S., and I write him a very thank you letter to this Monsignor. And we start pen pals. Once a year, twice a year, we're writing letters. About 3 years later, he left Rome, and he went to St. Louis, and he became an auxiliary bishop of the Catholic Church in St. Louis. And 5 years later, he became the Archbishop of Milwaukee. And 4 months ago, he was named the Archbishop of New York. His name is Timothy Dolan, about to be Cardinal Dolan. So for my research on my father, knocking on the door, and this Monsignor Dolan brings me in to explain my father's records, he now is in New York, about to be Cardinal Dolan, who has his connection to the Vatican. Life brings you to certain avenues. And so to do the book, does it sound like I had fun? I did. I had a tremendous amount of fun because I took what I knew, I took what I had done in my life in terms of my feeling, and I put it into a book, used the history to wrap that around a fictional account based upon some characters. Maybe my father would have been, if he had stayed with the Times-Union and won a few prizes, could have gone to Washington, maybe he would have been a famous reporter. I think the Depression maybe robbed him of that opportunity. but you can think that way. So in your mind, think about what you like the most. Think about what you feel comfortable in writing. And maybe you can put a story together based upon some fact or some wish that you might have had in your own life. Doing the research, talking to the people was tremendously rewarding for me. And as I look on it now, I had fun. I don't think I could do another one because I don't feel that same way about research, religion, and politics, and to find some other subject. I'm not sure I have some other motivation to do it. But I was able to bring family, Albany, New York, some Port Authority experiences, my feelings about the Catholic Church, politics and religion, the abuse of power, quotes in the back of the book from history. And maybe people will read it and think a little more about what's going on around them. So I've said a lot. I'm going to ask you for questions now. So start to think if there's something that either I said or I haven't said that you'd like to talk to me about.
I have a question, because I read the book. An important part of the book is Vatican II, why that was called.
Yes. Vatican II, in the book, part of the plot is that Vatican II was a redo of the Catholic Church. And there were great divisions in the church on Vatican II. Yes, there were changes made, but there was a minority who said, we've been doing this for 2,000 years, and there's no reason to change. There's no reason to make it a modern church. We should leave it alone. And it was changed anyway. And my feeling, and it's not a feeling, I know that to this day, there is a hardcore group in Rome who still feels that Vatican II was wrong. And if they have their ways, they're going to change the church back and kind of make it the way it was. And little things happen all the time that take away the Vatican II changes. Is that surprising? Politics. It's politics.
Could you mention all the Pope John the 23rd's study group?
Yes.
Is that true?
That would now John the 23rd, as people don't know, was the ambassador for the Vatican to Turkey before he became Pope. So what does that tell you? It tells you that he had a feeling about Islam. And in terms of opening up channels to Islam. Now, opening up channels to Islam are not to the people who are the extremists, but to the people who every day, and let's face it, they pray 3 times a day. If somebody kneels down and prays 3 times a day, they can't be all bad unless they have a leader who's telling them that they should be bad. So John the 23rd saw a little of that. Now, I've used an assumption that he had opened up new avenues to Islam. I don't know whether that's true or not, but there's enough evidence out there that I think he probably did. And there's also evidence, not evidence, it's a fact, that on his bed table, night table for bedtime reading, was a big book on the Cathedral at Chartres. It was one of his favorite readings, was on this cathedral, and the history of the site. So does that fight of politics between the conservatives and the liberals still go on in the church today? Yes. And I have put this Opus Dei group, which I happen to think is very conservative, as the bad guys in the book. And they're trying to, overthrow the papacy and take control, put their person in. Has that happened? Sure it does. Sure it does. And now talk about politics. Now, to me, I'm a Catholic. I've been a Catholic all my life. I still believe in it. I still think it's right. And yet I feel the politics of the church are hard to understand. Now, during Vatican II, John the 23rd dies. Have to elect a new pope. So Pope Paul is elected. But you go back and you read, you do the research. How did he get elected? How did they make the agreement between the political groups, the conservatives and the liberals? How did they do it? Paul said to the conservatives, if you make me pope and you elect me, I will put a bunch of conservative bishops on the birth control commission. So that when that commission is done, there are 12 people on there now, I'm going to put on another 15, and all 15 of those will be conservatives. So if you make me pope, this is what I'll do. They said, that sounds great. He's elected. What does he do? He puts 15 conservatives onto the Birth Control Commission and feels, I've done my part. The Birth Control Commission comes back and says, we've concluded it's wrong. What? What happened to the 15 people? Well, they went there and they listened. And guess what? They all decided that it should be changed. And the Pope says, wait a second, I made the commitment to these people. I wasn't going to change it, so I'm not going to change it. That's politics. That's not religion. And we have to understand that in all institutions, every institution you can think of, where more than a dozen people get together, there's politics involved. Well, if you do what I do, I'll take you to dinner next week. And if you give me your vote, I'll give you my vote. It's not bad. It's just the way that human nature is. You have to understand it and understand that what you see is not always what's really going on. So the Vatican II controversy that I explain in this book is still going on today. It's conservatives and liberals, and who's right and who's wrong. I spent time talking to U.S. theologians, people in the universities. Today, there are more people receiving doctorate degrees in theology at Catholic universities than in the history of this country. More people getting PhDs in theology, men, women, married couples. And what the theologians have told me is there's no shortage of people to be priests in this country. There's a shortage of imagination. And as soon as married people and women can be leaders in the church, the crisis is over. And he said to me, and this is a theologian from Boston College, he said to me his favorite line, he said, what's the difference between Jurassic Park, the movie about dinosaurs and stuff, right, and the Vatican? And I said, well, the difference between Jurassic Park and the Vatican, he said, yes, one's a movie and one's a theme park for dinosaurs. So what we're faced with an institution with history. That of all your reasons, once something is in motion, it stays in motion. Well, that's the Vatican. It's in motion, and it's not wrong. To go slow and change is not wrong, particularly when you're talking about theology. Maybe people don't understand it all. But after a while, you have to understand that a lot of it is politics. And I think my trouble with my faith is that my faith's not based on politics. My faith is based on what I believe in. And when I see people, because of politics, decide what has to be done, then I feel that you need to speak out. So I've talked a little bit in here about, and that's the beauty of fiction. You can say these kinds of things, right? If I was writing a factual book, I couldn't say that. But in a fictional story, I can blame anybody. But to answer your question on the Vatican II, it's going on today, this fight in the church. More questions?
Now, what's true and what's not?
Well,
The Pope did that or didn't he do that?
the Pope did load the Birth Control Commission. That's true. That's true. And if you and in here, I've tried to make the historic facts accurate. The business about the reporter in Washington trying to rescue the terrorist in the Vatican, that's all fiction. But the historic facts about the church in here, if you'll with maybe one or two very minor exceptions, I've tried to take my understanding of history. Now, I don't consider myself a historian, but I consider myself a student of history. And I think I've collected enough in here to say that the history portion of it is I would say, is factual. Question?
Along those lines, we've got a terrorist being harbored in the Vatican. And I haven't read the book, so what time period are we talking?
1980s.
Okay. During World War II, was it Pius the 12th? Mm-hmm. Didn't he harbor, was Nazi?
No. I think the criticism of him is that he was not strong enough speaking out against the Holocaust. But again, if you go back and look at the records, you'll find out that he did. He not only spoke out about it, but he had set up houses in Rome to protect the Jewish people from the Italians. So he did speak out against it. However, in my book, what I do point out is that in history, if you think of Watergate, the big thing in Watergate was follow the money. You know, follow the money, follow the money. I make the statement, follow the meetings. Find out who was meeting and when, and then look after that what happens. Okay? So there's a meeting in here that I record that in 1939, thereabouts, Cardinal Pacelli, who's going to become Pope Pius XII, he's still Cardinal, he's Secretary of State. So he comes to Washington, he has a lot to do with Washington politics, he's back and forth between Rome and Washington. He's a big player in Washington. But then the Pope at that time gets sick. So you kind of know there's going to be a conclave, okay? He comes and meets with Joe Kennedy in Bronxville. Joe Kennedy? You mean Joe Kennedy, who has all his mafia connections in Chicago? I wonder why it was important for him to meet with a mafia guy in the U.S. Unless, now my other thing in my book, if you think of the mafia in Italy, they influence every level of every institution in Italy. But of course, they're not in the Vatican or the Vatican Bank. Maybe, I don't know, but if it looks like they're in every place around you, and every time you turn around, they're either killing a prosecutor or hanging a judge someplace because the mafia says they're not doing what they want, are they in the Vatican Bank? I don't know. But in my book, I say probably. Now, is Cardinal Pacelli meeting with Joe Kennedy because the mafia in Italy wants to know, is he going to play ball? But what? Who knows? But I can tell you one thing. 6 months later, he's Pope, and Kennedy is ambassador to London. And Pacelli was Secretary of State with his influence in Washington. So if you follow the meetings, now how do you know the meeting took place? Well, if you read one of the Kennedy books of their life, it's in the book that they remember being on Cardinal Pacelli's lap in their house in Bronxville when he came to visit their father. And they give the date. Did he go to see Joe Kennedy so they could pray together? I don't think so, but they might have. It's politics. It's politics. Just be aware. You have to be aware of politics and religion, and they're like this. Why? Because people are involved. And you can go back 500 years. It was the same thing. The same thing. Hope you've gotten a couple of ideas, and maybe you'll go read the book. Thank you.